Dobrý den, vážené dámy, vážení pánové. Já vás...
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth section of our conference. It's the fourth day of the conference, and today we will be dealing with the essence of what the conference is about. So, as you know, we are going to talk about sacral monuments and authoritarian regimes. I believe that this topic is an essence of these discussions and exchanges. So, technically speaking, this session will last until 1:15. The audience can ask questions on the YouTube channel. I'm going to introduce our panelists, our speakers. So, let's look at the first presentation. I'd like to say that this session is for everyone who is interested in monument care, heritage care. The second half of the 20th century, with the exception of the last 10 years, was a period of ideological struggles that were reflected also in heritage care and had a direct impact on cultural monuments. So our first speaker is Mikhail Sklanath from the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. He's also a co-organizer of the conference. He studied history studies and he graduated from the Catholic Theological Faculty of Charles University in Prague. So he's a historian and a theologian, focusing on the history of the church, liturgy, studies, and for us, its most important focus is his focus on sacral buildings, sacral monuments, including their history. The topic is the sacralization and de-sacralization of the Czech landscape. So, Dr. Sklenář, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If we had the opportunity to see the transformation of the Czech landscape between the 9th and the 20th centuries from the point of view of sacred buildings, sacral buildings as a film in accelerated mode, we would see the same thing in certain periods: creation and disappearance. The phenomena of founding, destroying, rebuilding, repairing, and abandoning buildings intended for the liturgical celebration and the buildings attached to them had certain phases, although, of course, they very often took place in parallel. In my presentation, I will try to connect these phases into a long, continuous line of history of a very important part of the European and Czech cultural landscape. In the title of my paper, I therefore refer to Ferdinand Paul Brodel, who enriched historiography with the concept of long duration, longue durée, in line with this approach, which emphasizes the view of transformations over very long periods of time. I'll focus on the Czech environment and Christian religious buildings. In my presentation, I will offer a possible periodization of sacralizations and de-sacralizations of the Czech cultural landscape, characterized by a large number of sacral monuments and small sacred buildings. I will focus on the overall trend and the main line, presenting theses for discussion. For the purposes of the paper, I associate sacralization primarily with Christianity and understand it as a process in which Christian sacred buildings and small sacral monuments appeared purposefully in the landscape as a material and visible expression of religiosity and personal spirituality. The rationalized action against denominationally defined buildings and the processes associated with their decay are then referred to as de-sacralization, although in the former case we can also speak of targeted profanation. Looking at the map of contemporary Czech Republic, it would seem that approximately 15,000 larger and 60,000 smaller sacral buildings form a self-evident, permanent, unproblematic part of the local cultural landscape and somehow naturally belong to the local cultural heritage. However, when we take a closer look, we have to talk about the phases or processes of several sacralizations and desacralizations, the very variable and sometimes problematic position of sacral buildings. The topic is therefore not trivial and opens up a number of questions. The process of Christianization is crucial for the settlement of the landscape with Christian sacral buildings. In Moravia and Bohemia, it took place during the second half and at the end of the 9th century. In parallel with Christianization, a process of sacralization was initiated, which continued until the first quarter of the 15th century. Important settlements, administrative centers, and strongholds were given sacred buildings, which not only testified to the advancing Christianization and represented one of its instruments, but they also served to represent and legitimize the prince and later his retinue, the germs of the future nobility. The founding activity of the monarch and the nobility was subsequently continued in the towns that were built, and at the same time as chapels and churches, complexes of monasteries were built. All of the above-mentioned trends further accelerated during the 14th century during the reign of the Luxembourgs. The upward trend came to a halt in the wake of the Hussite Wars, during which we have to distinguish well between a distinctly Calixtine Bohemia and a distinctly Catholic Moravia. Hussite iconoclasm needs to be seen in the context of the times, bearing in mind both exaggerated interpretations and downplaying, as well as inconsistent attitudes within the movement. The radical wing of the Hussites did, however, destroy monasteries and the interior decoration of churches and committed aggression against the clergy and the monks. This was an iconoclasm associated with violence that preceded the European Reformation by a full century. At the same time, however, the Bohemian environment of the 15th century did not produce parallel styles of Christian sacral new buildings. Rather, there was a Catholic restoration or Calixtine purification of existing buildings. The fundamental transformations of the Czech cultural landscape thus took place in a completely changed atmosphere. In the early modern period, in the Europe of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, and the 30 Years' War, in a confessional Catholic monarchy. The first manifestations of the next wave of sacralization can be found as early as 1620 and 21, after the defeat of the Estates Revolt, the end of the Bohemian War, and the beginning of the efforts to consolidate the lands of the Bohemian crown by the Habsburgs. Local events were also linked to the gradual application of the conclusions of the Council of Trent. Thus, from the second quarter of the 17th century onwards, a composite Bohemian Baroque landscape gradually emerged, with renewed church administration, parishes, pilgrimage sites, old and new religious institutions and their building projects, and small sacral buildings. At the time of Enlightenment absolutism and the considerable subordination of organized religiosity to the supervision of the state, a wave of sacralization and a wave of desacralization mixed in the Czech environment at the end of the 18th century. The period emphasizing the centralism of Vienna thus has a distinctly ambivalent charge. Sacralization was connected with the consolidation of church administration from the level of episcopacy to the functional system of parishes. De-Sacralization involved the dissolution of monasteries and the profanation of some sacred buildings. Sacralization can also be associated with tolerated non-Catholic confessions in certain parts of Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia and their building activities, albeit restricted by state regulations. The fourth wave of sacralization hit the Czech lands during the long 19th century. Older spiritual impulses and older architectural expressions, especially Gothic, became appropriate means of promoting a Catholicism increasingly confronted with the problems of revolution, liberalism, and alternative offerings with political and social content. The papacy and hierarchy feared any change during this era, and in an effort to preserve the status quo, rejected the modern age and almost everything it brought. Thus, the typical Czech sacralized landscape, a neo-Baroque landscape with new churches built in neo-styles, for example in Prague, timid attempts at a new style, and above all with small chapels, crosses, statues, and divine torments, was only just emerging at this time. The competing offers mentioned above were not only about the arrangement of public things, but also about public space. In the 19th century, churches began to recede from their position as landmarks, as the Industrial Revolution and the urban liberal environment brought new monuments in the form of factories, theaters, museums, sports venues, and banks. While Catholic architecture openly gravitated towards the prominence of sacred buildings, non-Catholic Christians, now free, instead wanted to take advantage of nature's possibilities and more subtle architectural expression. The end of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century was marked by further sacralization, or rather sacralizations. After the establishment of the Czechoslovak Republic, Catholicism found itself on the defensive. The St. Wenceslas Millennium in 1921, associated for our topic with the completion of St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague, is considered a certain turning point. On the other hand, non-Catholic communities sought to use modern architecture for their own needs, that is, building churches, choirs, columbariums, facilities for preachers and the community. Many buildings of the Evangelical Church of Czech Brethren and the Czechoslovak Hussite Church were built in the constructivist or functionalist style. Sacral construction was interrupted by the Second World War and the so-called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. I now turn to the second part of my contribution. We have already heard some detailed presentations on some things I'll mention, but it's good to make an overview. After 1945, the Czech lands witnessed another wave of desacralization and general devastation of cultural, far from only sacral monuments. I cannot fail to mention the catastrophe of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the destruction of Jewish monuments in Nazi-occupied countries. Some of them were subject to further destruction later, when there were no longer any communities to look after them. Synagogues and Jewish cemeteries became targets of devastation, vandalism, dismantling for construction or business purposes, or may have been rebranded for other purposes. The problems associated with the desacralization wave are most pronounced in the Czech borderlands, from where Czech Germans, very often Catholic Christians, were expelled. The new inhabitants of the border villages no longer had a direct relationship with the local churches and cemeteries. And so, in addition to the social and cultural discontinuity, we have to speak of a religious discontinuity, all of which are still evident in these places today. Not only the religious centers, but entire villages have been affected by the gradual creation of a forbidden border zone from which the inhabitants had to move further inland and their original homes disappeared. Sometimes we can very well locate another reason for the disappearance of entire villages and settlements, namely the emergence of military areas. I remind you of the map we saw yesterday, where settlements and religious buildings resemble only ruins. Other times, however, we cannot proceed geographically and simply point to a list of objects, lists of buildings. The so-called ecclesiastical laws eliminated the economic autonomy of Catholic churches and non-Catholic religious communities, and the state took over the responsibility for the repair and maintenance of the buildings. Of course, not all pre-1949 sacred buildings can be considered ideally repaired and maintained, but the system of cooperation between the parish or other church institutions and the church patron and other donors was replaced by a state monopoly. At the same time, however, the same state promoted a militantly atheistic ideology, so that very often there was no willingness to repair or do routine maintenance, and parishes organized maintenance on their own. These interventions did bring the communities together, but they were not always appropriate and expertly carried out. And this also applies to the transformation of the interiors after the Second Vatican Council. If we talk about the creation of waterworks of various types and mining activities, it is worth pointing out that settlements or monuments were damaged or destroyed for these reasons before 1948 and before 1945. Similarly, we can find examples of the devastation of buildings from previous years for other reasons. However, in the second half of the 20th century, the state became more involved in these projects, and they became part of the ideological narrative of a successful socialist society, building new dams and exploiting natural resources. As the archaeologist Jan Klapště states in the context of the destruction of the city of Most, I quote, "The fate of Most was not a contemporary utopia, but the insatiable need and consumption of lignite as the main energy source. At the same time, there was a de facto disregard for soft values, not only the landscape and historic buildings, but also the health of the people. The fate of Most and the Most region cannot be separated from the totalitarian nature of the communist regime, which ensured the unconflicted destruction of the former royal town and dozens of surrounding villages." End of quote. In the case of the First World War, the Czech lands did not become a place where the front line was located and where clashes brought with them the devastation of settlements, including religious monuments. The Second World War also affected the area in a different way, with air raids only towards the end of the war. Although the Czechoslovak Republic avoided the destruction of historic settlements during the world conflicts, after the end of the Second one and after its liberation from Nazi totalitarian rule, it embarked on a path towards totalitarian communist rule. Already the period after May 1945 was filled with tension and violence, and it was then that the next, probably the most violent phase started. It would certainly be naive to assume that the destruction occurred exclusively in the second half of the 20th century. Recall how many sacral and non-sacral monuments we have encountered with reports of burning or inappropriate interventions. But its scale, systematic nature, and lingering effects surpassed all previous waves of desacralization. The wave of desacralization that began after 1945 and continued for decades thereafter was not only enormous in terms of the number of damaged or destroyed objects, but also in terms of the depth of desacralization. It was not a simple removal, but a process of total cultural alienation, which is most evident in areas where the continuity of settlement has been interrupted, where decaying religious buildings are still frequently encountered. Many individual cases could be cited, but in terms of a long period of time, we can speak of two main sources of desacralization waves. In the past, they were caused both by confessional tensions and wars, Hasidicism, 17th century, and by state-controlled interventions, early 17th century, late 18th century, and the second half of the 20th century. But even the last of these cannot simply be linked to communist totalitarian rule, although its legislation and specific actors had a major influence and interest in the desacralization wave. The church and organized theistic religiosity were marginalized on many levels, and just as atheist propaganda offered alternative civil ceremonies to the liturgy accompanying important life moments, the decay of religious buildings was accompanied by the creation of new representative buildings associated with the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The trend of advancing secularization in the Euro-American West was aptly described by Joseph Ratzinger, then professor of dogmatic theology. In his 1969 lecture, he spoke of the Roman Catholic Church as a community that would define itself in a different way and would no longer be able to use the buildings created during the Great Boom. The care of sacred monuments, not only in the Czech Republic, but also in other countries of the Euro-American cultural circuit, is being taken over by government units, associations, or individuals to whom the weakened church institutions sell or donate them. This process is often painful and leads to conflicts. The use and possible adaptation of existing religious spaces for new purposes is also a very serious issue. In addition to the cultural, historical, or conservation perspective, we can mention the theological and liturgical perspective, which underlines the seriousness of the issue from within the church. The exhaustion or weakening of the community, whether Catholic or non-Catholic, leads to the serious question of whether it makes sense to invest time and money in saving a building intended for the celebration of the liturgy, when the liturgy is no longer celebrated there, or is celebrated, for example, once a year, and the building becomes only part of panorama and a mere monument. The primary, generally accepted sacred and liturgical definition of buildings was thus transformed into a primarily monumental one, where the value of a building is seen in its furnishings and it's important for local memory. Ladies and gentlemen, the Josephine parish system provided the faithful with a church close to where they lived, but drew on a fundamentally different array of clergy, active Christians, and donors. Today, we can see in the Czech Republic, side by side, sometimes very close indeed, quite different processes. First, continued desacralization and decay. Second, the construction of new churches and the repair of ruined sacred buildings or statues and other monuments with a relationship to religious practice. And third, a historicizing and cultural approach that preserves buildings with no relationship to religious practice. It is with an eye to an example of transformation for the better, at least visually, that I conclude my paper, and thank you for your attention.
Já děkuji Michalu Sklenáři, určitě velmi zajímavý příspěvek.
Thank you for this presentation, Michal Sklenář. I expect to have some comments, reactions, questions to this presentation, which will happen at the end of the session. And now let me introduce the next speaker.
Van der Meulen.
It is Mr. van der Meulen, Marcus van der Meulen. Studied the university in Leuven, where he studied architecture with specialization on monument preservation. He now works on the Faculty of Architecture, with the Faculty of Architecture on Aachen University. And he is also counselor of the Council for the Sacral Heritage, religious heritage. And his today paper concerns the history of Polish religious monuments in the period after the Second World War. He also specializes on the identity of these monuments and their restoration. For today's contribution, he chose the subject of Warsaw and its renovation after the Second World War. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I will start immediately. Warsaw was rebuilt after the Second World War as capital of a new socialist state. During the occupation, much of the city had been damaged, and after the failed uprising of 1944, many monumental buildings were blown up by the Nazis in retaliation. Adolf Siborowski presented in his book, Warsaw, A City Destroyed and Rebuilt, published in several languages in 1964, that the reconstruction of Warsaw was the result of a profound determination of the Polish people to bring back their capital to its former glory. However, in the first months after the war, it was uncertain Warsaw would be the capital of the Polish People's Republic, and even less certain it would be reconstructed. The preliminary government in Lublin could not come to a final decision about which city would be the capital of the new socialist state. Boleslav Bierut, the later de facto head of state, turned to Moscow for advice. And here, Bierut was supported by Stalin to designate Warsaw as capital city. This would guarantee the perception of continuation. And in Moscow, Bierut was advised to rebuild the capital as soon as possible. The first designs for rebuilding the capital by Helena and Simon Circus were made according to the concept of the functional city as formulated by Sion. These and other plans were reviewed by delegation from Moscow. A first delegation of experts, led by Nikita Khrushchev, came to Poland in 1945. A second delegation to look at a master plan for rebuilding the capital followed in 1946. Delegation members Baburov and Chernyshov, professors from the Moscow Institute of Architecture, wrote about the first designs for rebuilding the city, and I quote, "In your plan, the city center is imagined as a large area of state, administrative, industrial, economic, and financial services, and at the same time as a commercial city. In this case, the functional division seems to us to be pushed too far. We must not make the center the city of a capitalist city. In the time of democracies, cities grew around squares, which were meeting rooms for citizens on an urban scale. It seems to us that the authors of the plan have put a lot of care on how to cross the city, but too little on how to stay there, together there. A modern city in a democratic country must have its open-air meeting rooms near the parliament, the municipality, the theatre," end of quote. The plans to rebuild Warsaw as a functionalist city were replaced by new plans. These consisted of reconstructing parts of the historic city and squares, included selected built heritage. An office for rebuilding was created, the Bureau for Rebuilding the Capital, or BOS. The BOS played a leading role in the publications about rebuilding that were used by the authorities to create a feeling of national unity in reconstruction of the nation's capital. Head architect of the rebuilding of the capital became Joseph Sigalin. Sigalin later wrote in his memoirs that Bierut was present every week to learn about the progress about the rebuilding of the capital. Leading architect for the reconstruction of the architectural monuments became Jan Zachvatowicz. In the Warsaw Escarpment, the publication of the boss, Zachvatowicz wrote, and I quote, "The role of the monument in the new life must be complete. The confirmation is connected with the range of influences that shape the psyche through emotions of aesthetic or historical nature, and finally, through a normal didactic function. Nevertheless, the monument must find a suitable use as an object in the largest organism, be it the neighborhood or the city. A church must remain a church." This concluded a short debate on what purpose reconstructed churches would have, not a museum or other new purpose, but a living place of worship. In 1947, the Primate's Office for the Rebuilding of Churches was founded, which played a role in financing and coordinating the reconstruction of ecclesiastical buildings. However, on the external appearance of the building, they were not the final decision maker. In 1949, the 6-year plan for rebuilding by Boleslav Birut was published. This publication presented to the Polish nation the objectives of reconstruction, and it included impressions of the reconstruction and of how the capital would look like. The 6-year plan was a political pamphlet aimed at fostering a patriotic feeling in the reconstruction of the capital. In the early Soviet period, the term reconstructia was used to signify the large-scale rebuilding and replanning of the urban fabric that went with the process of constructing the socialist city. And immediately after the Great Patriotic War, the determination emerged to reconstruct architectural monuments that had been destroyed by the fascist invader. And during reconstructions, monuments would be liberated, not only from war damage, but also from layers that damaged the purity of buildings. The reconstruction of Warsaw was similar. Renovation of war-damaged buildings had, of course, already begun after the war had ended. Historic buildings that had been recently renovated were demolished if they did not fit into the new master plan. An example is the Church of St. Andreas on Theatre Square, designed by Piotr Eichner. Buildings, streets, and open-air meeting rooms, as Baburov and Chernyshev had called them, were liberated from unwanted features. Key public buildings dating from the period of the Constitutional Congress Poland, the years between Congress of Vienna and the failed uprising of 1830, were reconstructed in the open-air meeting rooms. And these public buildings were even remodeled, modified, to better complement the new urban design if necessary. Already during the interwar period, ideas to reshape Warsaw had been explored. The critique at the time was the city lacked the grandeur of a capital and monuments associated with Polish statehood. A theoretical discourse on the appearance of Polish architecture developed. It will take too long to go into details, but modifying public buildings to give them a more Polish appearance became acceptable and even desirable in the circles of monument preservationists. To make faithful reconstructions, Tiborowski stresses that the paintings of Bellotto were used. This is partially correct. But even more important is the patriotic rationale behind this statement. Reconstruction became the setting of a stage that intentionally looked like the city of Stanisław Poniatowski, the last elected monarch of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the driving force behind the 3rd of May Constitution. Churches are a significant part of this historic urban landscape as depicted by Bellotto. For example, the Church of St. Casimir in the new town market square. The building was designed by one of the most significant Polish architects of the period, Tilman Komerski, and founded by Queen Maria Kazimiera, the wife of King Jan Sobieski, national hero. The war had left the church largely destroyed. The Prince Department of the University of Warsaw had in their collection the original designs by Komerski. And the Polytechnic University had a large collection of measurement drawings made by students during the interwar period. Maria Zachvatova made the design for reconstruction. Some of the walls that were still standing were pulled down and rebuilt. The dome was first covered in iron sheet and a few years later replaced by copper sheets, now paid by the church. Also, the interior fittings, such as the altar, the amber, the tabernacle, and other furnishings used in the liturgy, were commissioned and financed by the primate's office for rebuilding churches. The interior is a simplified version of the original. The interior was the dominion of the primate's office, which was more interested in a space suitable for the celebration of the liturgy than in a correct reconstruction of the monument. The main religious building in the historic center of is the Archcathedral of St. John. This building is of lesser architectural significance, yet it has what we call today heritage values of association. Several monarchs of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were crowned here. The most significant event was the celebration related to the adoption in 1791 of the 3rd of May Constitution. Reconstruction began in 1947 under supervision of Jan Sachatovitz. First, the debris of 4,000 cubic meters had to be cleared. In the rubble, there were valuable remains, such as tombstones, architectural elements, and artworks. Some parts of the buildings were in relatively good shape, including some of the walls of the presbytery and the northern wall of the nave. Much of the original bricks were recuperated and used in the restoration. A modern framework of reinforced concrete columns and ceiling was placed in the center of the historic building. The brick outer walls have thus been converted from structural to curtain walls. The vaults, however, were made in a technique similar to that used in the late Middle Ages, and the bricks used for the ribs were made as faithful copies from the original. New bricks and tiles for the roof were made using traditional techniques. The exterior was finished in 1952. Work on the interior included for several years. Photographs of the church interior show a large altarpiece, yet in the rebuilt version, there is a new center with a Polish icon of the Black Madonna of Częstochowa. But even more interesting is the hypothetical reconstruction of the facade, the part of the building that is in the public space. Although a large amount of documents were available, including photographs, the new facade was not a recreation of its pre-war condition. In the first phase, various possibilities were proposed, from a faithful reconstruction of the neo-Gothic facade to the creation of a hypothetical medieval tower. Eventually, two designs were made, one based on a few images available of the facade before the neo-Gothic remodeling, and one hypothetical design in the style of the regional Vistula Gothic. The latter was chosen. This choice is in keeping with the tradition of monument preservation of the early 20th century in parts of Poland under Russian rule, when this regional variant of Gothic was seen as a Polish national building style. Already during the interwar period, the idea to remodel monumental buildings to make them more Polish had been explored. The idea behind it was to obliterate the different building cultures of the foreign rule. The hurt criticism of Warsaw at the time had also been the lack of monuments that represent Polish statehood. The reconstruction of the cathedral, a place of coronations, and the adoption of the celebrated constitution became the construction of such a national monument. Outside the historic center, also some architectural monuments were reconstructed. The urban plan for Three Crosses Square was one of those examples where the expert delegation from the Soviet Union made suggestions for improvement. It was recommended to create an outdoor meeting room connecting significant public buildings, including the National Museum and the Socialist Party building. An impression of this new public space was included in the publication, the 6-year plan of rebuilding the capital, that was distributed among the nation. And then a sketch, a pantheon as depicted. There was the original appearance of St. Alexander's Church before the extensive remodeling at the end of the 19th century. This church had been dynamited by the Nazis in 1944. In 1947, a first design for rebuilding, much as it had appeared before destruction, was made by Bohuš. This proposal was rejected by the boss. A design competition was organized. The winners proposed to reconstruct the original Pantheon design by Piotr Eichner. The heritage value of the neoclassical building was much higher than that of the later remodeling of the church in the neo-Renaissance style. Eichner's design was part of the transformation of Warsaw as a modern capital during the years of Polish self-rule after the Congress of Vienna. It is known the Primate's Office for Rebuilding Churches objected to this reconstruction to Eichner's design. It correctly noted this building had fewer places for the faithful than the church had been destroyed. There seems to develop some kind of agreement. Authorities agreed to have a contest for the construction of a modern church nave adjacent to Pantheon by Eichner. A design competition was organized. However, the construction of the new nave to accommodate the faithful was not executed. The final rebuilding project was led by Stanislav Marcinski and realized between 1949 and 1952. The importance as a place of worship was not leading in the reconstruction. The socialist authorities rebuilt their anticipated version of the monument, a neoclassical pantheon, an object that fitted the stage of this square, a public space that connected significant administration buildings. Monument care included demolition of some of the existing building. As the photograph shows, parts of the neo-Renaissance building, including the tower, were damaged but not destroyed. Protests against the destruction of this bell tower were ignored. The new church was largely a new building. Apart from some of the interior, the dimensions of the Ministry of Economic Recovery that had already been constructed were leading in the reconstruction of the church, and not the other way around, as Chiborowski misleadingly recalls in his publication. The shape of the reconstructed church was adapted to better complement the existing ministry building. As had happened with other monuments, if required, the design was adjusted to better meet the overall urban design. What counted was the external appearance of this historic monument in the new scenography of this square. The architectural monuments that could be related to key periods in the history of the Polish nation were recreated. After the reconstruction, Warsaw looked very different from how it had appeared in 1918. Before the First World War, the religious landscape of Warsaw had been diverse. After the end of the Second World War, an almost homogeneous Roman Catholic city emerged. The Russian Orthodox churches had been removed during the interbellum, and the Jewish synagogues were destroyed during the Nazi occupation. The three churches presented today were all rebuilt during the period 1949 and 1956. At the time, Warsaw was reconstructed in accordance with the development of Stalinism under the patronage of Beirut. Although it was often the Primate's Office for Rebuilding of Churches that coordinated the rebuilding of churches, the final decision maker was the boss. Josef Sigalin, the head architect supervising the rebuilding of the capital, wrote in his memoirs that Beirut was the ultimate decision maker. The case of St. Alexander's Church shows that the Primate's office was preoccupied with building a living place of worship with large enough space to accommodate the faithful, and not the appearance of the architectural monument. Monument preservation methods used during the reconstruction of Warsaw included the demolition of elements that were regarded undesirable. Rebuilding both used traditional and modern building techniques. The interiors, only briefly discussed today, were typically not reconstructed but simplified. The external appearance of these religious heritage buildings was adapted to have a more Polish character. The association with national heritage was important. It was a values-based approach of monument conservation rather than a material-based approach. The approach also touched upon what today is called living heritage approach, at least for the interiors. The purpose as a place of worship was more important than an accurate replication of the pre-war condition. And the production of new building material, such as tiles and bricks, were made using traditional techniques. Religious buildings played a part in the construction of the capital. Religious buildings with heritage values that could be used to construct a common Polish identity were rebuilt. The concept of reconstruction of patrimony to construct patriotism had a dual origin, both in interwar monument conservation theory and in Soviet theory. reconstructing these churches not in the first place as places of worship, but as a significant monuments that fitted the patriotic agenda of unifying the nation with the myth of rebuilding the capital, and with the construction of monuments representing that nation. A values-based approach of monument preservation with as the ultimate ambition the construction of a patriotic patrimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Předpokládám, že toto téma je rovněž velmi zajímavé, už jenom z toho titulu, že...
Thank you. This is an extremely interesting topic, and it's a precious opportunity to see heritage care in a country severely impacted by the Second World War, and many of the historical buildings were even intentionally destroyed. It's interesting to compare the post-war situation in the Catholic Poland, compare it to other countries of Central Europe, especially the so-called Eastern Bloc in Central Europe, where the situation was more profane or atheist situation. So it's a very interesting topic and example. Our next presentation is about the Czech context again. It's not directly related to the Second World War, but we will speak about the changes and devastation after 1948. It's related to the mining and the devastation of cultural monuments after the Second World War. Our next speaker is Mr. Honys from the National Heritage Institute, from the regional office in Ústí nad Labem. He graduated in history at the Charles University. He's a preservationist focusing on restoration in the National Heritage Management. He is one of the two organologists, which is a precious or rare specialization. So he works in the city of Ústí nad Labem in the north of the country, and also he researches monuments in the Ore Mountains. So the floor is yours. Thank you. I hope you can see my presentation. So, dear friends, my paper is devoted to the fate of sacral and exterior stone sculpture monuments in the North Bohemian mining area, the area of sub or mountain basin between the towns of Ústí nad Labem and Kadaň, specifically in the shadow of the better-known fate of the Duchcov Baroque Hospital with the Reiners fresco or the relocated Dean's Church in Most. It is based mainly on the files and documentary materials of the still provisionally inventoried fund of the mining area of the Territorial Department of the National Institute of Natural History in Ústí nad Labem. The condition of these monuments was adversely affected by the post-war population change and the political situation after 1948, when the law number 218 from 1949 on the economic security of economic management of churches by the state in an atmosphere of suppression of their social influence transferred the care of church buildings or religious buildings to the state Office for Church Affairs, and then to the regional and district church secretaries of the respective national committees. In the area, over 100 settlements were lost as a result of open-cast coal mining in the second half of the 20th century, as shown by a comparison of maps of a crucial part of the area 40 years apart, with, of course, an impact on the heritage stock. For the period before 1958, very little source information has been preserved on this topic, especially regarding rural buildings, due to the dysfunctional cooperation with the then very politically and organizationally limited conservation authorities. The surviving minutes of meetings of district conservators from the 1950s repeatedly report on the targeted vandalism of these monuments under the passive attitude of the National Security Corps. The beginning of the next stage of development until 1972 was in 1958, when the first Czechoslovak law on cultural monuments was approved against the background of the blasting away of the aforementioned Duchcov Baroque Hospital, which, among other things, enabled the establishment of the first professional regional, albeit poorly staffed organization, the Regional Center for State Monument Protection and Nature Conservation, abbreviated KSSPPOP, which was subordinate to the Regional National Committee. The latter had to deal with the problems of saving at least the removable elements of churches, chapels, and stone carvings that were destined to be destroyed by the spread of open-cast mining. Many of the churches were already looted and devastated. In 1965, the director of the Ústí KSSPPOP drew the attention of the Council of the North Bohemian National Committee to the poor condition of many churches, in the increasing cases of their vandalism, including churches in Vysočany and Březno near Chomutov, which had to be closed down, and the inertia of the state security officers to these cases. At that time, the conservation authorities at the District National Committee relied not only on cooperation with the KSSPPOP, whose director after Dr. Charvat was Dr. Sava Suchevich from the second half of the 1960s until the normalization, but also on voluntary district conservationists. For example, for the district of Teplice, it was Rudolf Bervich and later museum historian Jitka Budinská. For most, from 1969, museum historian Heide Manlová. In particular, the district cultural commissions played a role in the registration of monuments on the state lists. In the atmosphere of the late 1960s, the 1967 program of the cultural administration of the Most District Council, with a view to 1980, was also intended to help in dealing with monuments threatened by mining. The liquidation of the church buildings in the mining area, mostly owned by the Roman Catholic Church, involved, first of all, the purchase by the North Brown Coal Mine Society for an officially determined financial estimate. However, according to the decrees of the time, the estimated amounts were low, with no reflection of the art historical value, and the disagreement of the bishop's consistory in Litoměřice with them was deflected by the claim that there were no official financial quotas for buildings of this nature. A certain increase of the original amount was occasionally achieved through negotiations, but this amount was earmarked, and it was limited in time, for example, to 10 years. In the case of buildings considered to be listed, this was accompanied by a request for the removal of monument protection from the building, which, even if objected to by a specialist state conservation organization, was usually granted by the Ministry of Culture, given the primacy of mining interests, on the condition that a survey and photographic documentation of the building be made, an archaeological survey be carried out, and that valuable elements of furnishings or decoration be relocated. The fulfillment of these conditions sometimes had to be demanded by repeated requests. The demolition order was then issued, and the competent parish authority simultaneously or in advance, dealt with the removal and deposit or repositioning of the church furnishings, in the case of listed buildings, in cooperation or agreement with the conservation authorities. In the case of so-called movable monuments, in the spirit of the practice of the time and taking into account demolition plans, conservation was unfortunately applied very selectively. From the early phase of this period, we can mention the unique approach of the administrator from Ervěnice in the Most region, who, before the destruction of the local late Baroque church of St. James in 1959, unsuccessfully sought to ensure that the set of evicted church furnishings would not be dispersed into several buildings, but would be preserved in their entirety by relocating them to the church in Malé Březno. The increase in demolition plans gradually put the parish authorities concerned, as well as the heritage staff, in a tense situation with regard to securing transfers. In the case of the equipment of the church in Ervěnice, more than 10 fully loaded trucks were involved, which were difficult to secure in a socialist economy that favored other uses. And this concerns also storage space and changes in records. Moreover, in the case of unprotected churches, the demolition of the church usually took place without any professional documentation of its value. Although art historical analyses, focusing among others on the values of the most important chapels and churches, were prepared for the municipalities located in the area of planned expansion of mining since the 1960s by the staff of the SUPOP in Prague, the conditions for the fieldwork of the expert heritage protection staff were not adequate for the situation, at least until the early 1970s, reflected in the insufficient level and volume of documentation and problems with deposit spaces. In addition, for example, the Chomutov church secretary warned the clergy not to respond to the recommendations of the KSSPOP staff to relocate elements of endangered churches in advance, as any relocation of internal furnishings was conditional on consultation with the Church Affairs Department. The circumstances of the demise of the Church of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary in Bystřice u Kadaně, with its arch-slate Gothic presbytery from the early 16th century and valuable furnishings, may be illustrative of the times. In spite of the removal of some of the most valuable elements of the furnishings, after the displacement of the village in 1967, its interior was hastily and violently devastated, despite repeated appeals by the clergymen, who demanded that the remaining inventory be relocated quickly. Repeatedly asked to ensure supervision over the church, the district department of the police in Kadaň resolved the matter by writing to the KSSPPOP in Ústí nad Labem to consider whether the cost of relocation would not exceed several times the actual value of the monuments therein. The situation was ironically commented on by an article in the regional newspaper Nástup of 19th January 1967, in which the writer, perhaps a district conservator at the time, under the pseudonym of a certain Pepík, wondered about the destiny of the church's altars and organ to be filled in, with the reply, "If there was anything valuable in that church, those who understand it must have taken it away long ago." A similar fate befell the Baroque church of St. Wenceslas in nearby Čachovice, whose vaults bore valuable paintings with the theme of the St. Wenceslas legend by František Antonín Miller from 1751. Initial efforts by conservation experts to preserve the isolated church on a pillar in 1963 were rebuffed by mine representatives with economic arguments and by pointing out the unfavorable visual contrast of the church with the surrounding landscape degraded by mining. In the face of the gradual and natural devastation of the interior, in 1968, the Czech Fine Arts Fund's restorers succeeded in getting at least part of the vault paintings removed. However, the proposed removal of the remaining paintings the following year was not allowed, despite the indignation of the restorers, because access to the building was forbidden by the conservation authority on the grounds of the structural threat to the interior due to the dismantling and removal of the roof for use in the repair of a different religious building. The demolition of the church in 1970 put an end to all this. The location of the transfers of the removed paintings deposited in the monastery of Osek is still unresolved today. The classicist church of St. Michael in Tušimice was used as a grain storehouse by the local agricultural cooperative for the last years before its demise in 1972. After the early Baroque main altar was moved to a church in the village of Sena in Slovakia, with the curious justification that there was no other building in the village in a condition that would allow this use. Before the liquidation of the former Piarist Church of the Seven Joys of the Virgin Mary in Most after 1972, the interior walls of which bore a cycle of Rococo paintings by the regional painter Jan Václav Čeper from the early 1970s. Again, in the context of the surviving disdain for the art of the Baroque period, no effort was made to at least explore or even transfer them, apart from the removal of some of the oldest architectural elements and the clockwork. In contrast, in the case of the exterior stone sculpture monuments, for which the area was one of the richest in Bohemia, it was usually possible to save most of the better works from the spreading exploitation by moving them first to the depositories and partly to new locations from the 1970s onwards. Since at least 1968, the then KSSPBOP in Ústí nad Labem, through the directors of the mines, called on the management to specify their requirements for interventions in the villages in order to ensure the timely rescue of the monuments. This included securing the deposit areas, often located in remote monuments, for example, in the monastery in Osek, Jezeří Castle, in Duchcov. Since the 1960s, the depository in the then unused church of St. Wenceslas in Vysočany near Hradec was such a place. Initially, it was supervised by the Hradec restorer and district conservator, sculptor František Rada, who tried to solve the repeated break-ins by establishing cooperation with the surrounding municipalities regarding supervision. But he was met with incomprehension and even threat of arrest. Further break-ins in 1967 devastated the organ and the altar, and despite the subsequent walling off of the entrances by further break-ins through an unwalled window, although some of the stone artifacts and sculptures were destroyed, and the church was destroyed. Eventually, the depository had to be closed. Some of the artifacts were handed over to the museum in Chomutov. In situ works were also endangered. For example, this iconographically remarkable pillar on the 14 Holy Helpers from 1617 in Čechovice near Chomutov, which was already in the time before the transfer to Valtířov near Ústí nad Labem after 1716. For the nearby Virgin Mary and the statue of St. John of Nepomuk, already vandalized and broken, despite repeated attempts, not even a lorry was provided for their transport due to the busyness of other tasks. Increasing demands for the preservation of monuments in the mining areas of interest led on the 10th of August 1972 to the conclusion of the so-called tripartite agreement between the Ministry of Culture, the North Bohemian National Committee, and the Federal Ministry of Fuel and Energy on the settlement of damage to cultural monuments caused by mining activities, opening the last stage of the period. appropriate amounts of money were to be allocated for the purpose and specialized working groups were to be set up. The conclusion of the agreement was preceded by a bitter prelude in the form of a demand by the northern mines, Ležáky, in 1971 that the KSSVBOP in Ústí nad Labem should stop all rescue and documentation work, since until the agreement was concluded, the regulations in force did not allow for the reimbursement of the costs of documentation and rescue of the monuments. The activity of the three-member working group for the mining area at the KSSPOP in Ústí nad Labem is associated with the names of Dr. Karel Kraus and Sonia Rambousková, who were mainly responsible for the organization of surveys, documentation, including film documentation. This made it possible to a greater extent than in the previous period to carry out archaeological and restoration surveys, including structural and historical surveys, and also to arrange transfers of the most valuable elements of church decoration and furnishings, complicated, however, by the fact that the work could only be paid to so-called socialist organizations, not to proven individuals from the past. The usual practice of selling of unprotected church furnishings, with the exception of bells, which in view of the consequences of the wartime requisitions, the Diocese of Lidoměřice demanded be left for secondary use in other churches of the diocese, was replaced, with the exception of the organ, by a tendency to place them in other churches of the diocese. Within the ensemble of Most churches, besides the relocation of the Dean's Church in Most, the action of saving almost the entire ensemble of valuable Baroque furnishings of the Mennonite Church of St. Francis Seraphim before its destruction in 1977 deserves attention. It was prepared as early as 1975, when St. George's Church in České Zlatníky near Most was selected for transfer. Two options were considered: to relocate the entire facility except for the side columns of the main altar connected with the architecture of the churches and about 10 church pews, grills and some partial elements, or B, to relocate only the sculptural and prominent carving elements, including the altar paintings, for the gallery design of the interior. The architectural and design solution was made by architect Jindrák, who from the very beginning was inclined to implement the first variant and was also concerned with the possibility of relocating at least part of the vault fresco decoration, which was complicated by the different design of the vaults, cruciform, while in the Mennonite church plaque vaults prevailed. Architect Jindrák partially solved the problem by modifying the vault edges by sanding. The general contractor was the Stucco cooperative, with which, however, problems arose in the course of time. For example, the workers were suddenly recalled at the beginning of the 1980s to complete the restoration of the National Theatre. The restoration work on the sculptural and carving decoration of the altars, including paintings, was assigned by the CFAU Commission to a considerable number of restorers in the spirit of the contemporary separation of artistic elements, statues, paintings, from artisanal ones. Almost every statue was restored by someone else, with problems of coordination of finishing. This action dragged on for more than 15 years, given the situation at the time, and was accompanied in the 1980s by the destruction of some statues and other elements of the decorations of the altars made of artificial marble. In 1984, it was even marred by the emigration to the west of the restorer entrusted with part of the decoration of the altar of Saint Lidvina. The altar could not be retrieved from the studio, which had been sealed for months, until the following year, 1985. In the same year, however, Jiří Kotalik's statement, contrary to the initial concept, already recommended a gallery solution, including the presentation of the restorer's work, on the grounds that the complete altarpiece and some other elements of the furnishings did not need to be moved and installed. The initial intention, probably due to political circumstances, was therefore to establish an exhibition of Baroque art, demonstrating the socialist state's care for the cultural wealth of the mining area, including the level of the Czech Restoration School. Fortunately, despite the fact that the municipal council in Most tried to get rid of the building and sought to transfer it to the KSPOP in Ústí nad Labem, which however did not have the funds to run the building, the initial concept was maintained, although the completion took place in the already changed social conditions in 1992. The dimensions of the vaulted base and the dimensions of the presbytery did not allow the vault paintings and the architecture of the high altar to be fitted in full. Among the numerous other losses, we can mention the disappearance of the Baroque church of St. Peter and Paul in Liptice near Duchcov. From the 1720s, the work of the famous Litoměřice builder Octavian Broggio, whose interior was dominated by the convexly projecting architecture of the Baroque high altar and the Baroque pulpit. The given possibilities were at least made possible by the valuable discoveries. Gothic wall paintings in the interiors of the churches in Kopiště and Židovice near Most, and the somewhat younger chiaroscuro paintings in the Church of St. Nicholas in Holešce. In the case of the stone sculptures, the above-mentioned tripartite agreement made it possible to arrange for their relocation on the basis of an economic contract with the KSPOP, but not to cover the costs of possible restoration. For example, the sculptural decoration of the interior of the chapel of St. John of Nepomuk near Dřínov was moved to the premises of the pilgrimage church of Our Lady of Sorrows in Mariánské Hradčice, albeit with delays in the reimbursement of the costs. In addition, the placement of statues with religious themes in publicly exposed places was not always welcomed for political reasons. Almost all the sculptures from the historical core of Most, after temporary deposition, were concentrated at the Church of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross in Vtělno or in the village Bečov near Most. The stone sculptures from the liquidated Ervinice could not be comprehensively saved by transferring them to Malé Březno near Most. Also in the Chomutov region, the new placement of the stone sculptures from the closed depository in the Vysočany church was accompanied by problems. In contrast to the helpful approach of the municipality of Stropčice, the placement in Údlice was met with the inability of the municipality to ensure the preparation. The transferred sculptures were found damaged, and the implementation of the landscaping according to the design of engineer Bušek. The majority of these monuments from the villages of Ahníkov, Račice Naší, and Brančík u Chomutova were placed in the vicinity of the villages of Blahuňov and Místo. You can see this crucifix with Our Lady from Račice. The inhabitants demanded that it be left in its original place until the eviction. Among the more successful ones, we can cite the secondary placement of high-quality Baroque statues of St. Felix of Kantalicia and St. John of Nepomuk from the bridge in front of the church in Holešice, on the railing of the bridge in front of the church, and rectory in Mariánské Hradčice. However, older transfers were not always fully resolved. For example, the relief of Our Lady of Help from the niche chapel on the village of Hradlovka. Despite all the efforts, this could not be an equivalent substitute for the removal from the authentic location, that is the visually undoubtedly fortunate secondary location of the Baroque niche chapels with reliefs of the cycle of the Seven Sorrows of the Virgin Mary on the road to the Church of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross in Vdělno. This broke the original symbolic link with the area of the pilgrimage church in Mariánské Hradčice. Sometimes the sculptures found themselves in unfavorable contrast with modern buildings. The legacy of this unfortunate period is the still surviving lay perception that these monuments can continue to be moved according to current needs, not least the unclear provenance or ownership of some of the stone sculpture artifacts from the liquidated objects. With hindsight, it's clear that the work commitment of the KSPOP group at the time to save at least the most valuable sculptures was considerable, not including a considerable number of artifacts not protected as heritage. In the 1980s, fears of revanchism and the suppression of politically inconvenient stages of historical development were still alive, as well as the preference for monuments of the labor movement. An atmosphere of hectic maneuvering between alternations of transfers or new locations characterized the situation, which evokes comparisons with the Wagnerian term of ingenious improvisation, albeit forced in the given conditions, personal contacts, and purposeful argumentation in proportion to the political circumstances under the time pressure of mining interests, which was masterfully captured in the footage of the undoubtedly most interesting of documentary films about disappearing villages, Text for Light by Michal about the disappearance of the village of Vernéřov. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Honys, for this extremely interesting presentation.
České republice po druhé světové válce. A nyní tedy bychom hned...
this part of Bohemia after the Second World War. And now we will continue. Last contribution of this section is ahead of us. And it again concerns the situation after 1948, 1949. And again, we will see the situation in a particular region. Let me welcome Mr. Ladislav Holoubek, who represents the Diocese of Hradec Králové, and he is a postgraduate student right now at the Czech University. So the floor is yours. Dear colleagues, good afternoon. This is our common contribution. Together with my colleague, we will present the work and life of Hugo Doskočil. We have chosen a chronological approach. First, we will mention the basic dates of his life and his long-term work in Hradec Králové, in the Hradec Králové diocese, and then we will proceed to present his daily routine as a preservationist, which he carried out for a considerable period of time. In one person, we meet a man fully integrated into the Roman Catholic Church and holding important positions, and at the same time a state district conservator. Doskočil came from the East Bohemian village of Hnátnice, in German Friedrichswald, which is located in the district of Ústí nad Orlicí. He was born on the 1st of April 1875 into a peasant family. He returned to his native village during his life for personal and professional reasons, and he is also buried there. After graduating from the grammar school in Landskrona, where he graduated with honors in 1895, he decided to become a priest. For the Hradec Králové diocese, he entered the Bohemicum Czech College in Rome, a place of formation of the future Czech priests elite. Among the graduates of Bohemicum and later Nepomucenum, we find bishops, teachers in seminaries and theological faculties, and other important figures of the Czech church history. Hugo Doskočil studied theology at the Pontifical University of De Propaganda Fide, attained a doctorate, and ended his stay in Rome after his ordination on the 10th of March of the year 1900. The young priest of 25 returned to his home diocese and became part of the specific organism of the diocesan court. Official documents of doctrinal, disciplinary, and legal nature are of considerable importance for the functioning of the Roman Catholic Church, but its internal climate is also based on long-standing, repeatedly affirmed customs. These include, for example, obedience to superiors, personal piety, social intelligence, or success in pastoral care of the faithful. In addition, some gifted theologians are usually destined to hold leadership positions in the inner circle of the bishop, the center of the diocesan court, or specialized activities such as in church courts. They are usually tentatively directed to these positions during their studies and formation already. Hugo Doskočil, as a novice cleric, first spent a year in a chaplaincy position, but immediately after this brief experience, he went to the center of the diocese in Hradec Králové. Here he became the ceremonialist and secretary to Bishop Edvard Jan Brinich and Josef Doubrava. Their images are shown in the presentation together with a photograph of the historic part of Hradec Králové, where the bishop's residence and seminary are located. Doskočil's tasks included accompanying the bishop, assisting in the administration of the office, the organization and management of sacred ceremonies at pontifical services and episcopal functions. The gifted priest was subsequently sent to Vienna for further studies, where he stayed at Ferintaneum, the Viennese equivalent of Bohemica, and where he pursued 3 theological disciplines at the University of Vienna: biblical studies, dogmatic theology, and church law. The education was intended for future teachers in diocesan divinity schools, and Hugo Doskočil completed it with 3 rigorous examinations with distinction so that he could apply, and indeed he did, for graduation sub auspiciis, which means graduation in the presence of the Emperor Franz Joseph I. The ceremony took place on the 12th of July 1910, and according to his memoirs, Hugo Doskočil was to receive a ring from the monarch on this occasion, which he would wear on important occasions in later years. Even before graduating, he was already a lecturer at the seminary and an apprenticeship in Hradec Králové, working on the New Testament. Later, he became rector there for 38 years. It was an established institution with a tradition since 1802, with 5 years of study. He thus continued his time as a ceremonialist, remaining at the center of the diocese and devoting himself to the education of the future priesthood. Other positions were added to the rectorship over time: consistory council in 1914, prosynodal examiner in 1921, and he also served repeatedly on the diocesan court. Among various other titles, we may mention the Monsignorate of 1922 and the title of domestic prelate of His Holiness, the 1935 appointment brief of Pius XI seen in the presentation. The introductory information introduced us to Hugo Doskočil as a priest, successfully included in the bishop's court and the all-church cursus honorum. However, we are referring to him in this forum because in parallel with his position as rector and other intra-church positions, he served as state conservator for Hradec Králové district throughout the interwar period. The roles were in no way contradictory. The aforementioned Josef Doubrava had a considerable interest in art. His episcopate became part of his artistic patronage, and the Hradec Králové gallery today manages his extensive collections of paintings. On the initiative of Josef Doubrava, the history of Christian art was also taught in the seminary, and from the second half of the 1930s, Hugo Doskočil took over the teaching. Although he did not have a systematic education in the field, he was very well versed in it. In 1919, when a new system was established in the wake of the older structure of conservators, Hugo Doskočil also received his first appointment. He thanked Zdeněk, the leading Czech art historian and chief organizer of monument preservation, for, I quote, the precious favor of being entrusted with the honorary task of conservator for historical, artistic and popular monuments in the Hradec Králové district, and I want to give at the same time the assurance that it will be my sincere endeavor to devote all my care to protect the said monuments. In the same letter, he also reflected the change in the social atmosphere. I must mention, I quote, I must mention on this occasion that recently, when a social democratic camp of the people was held in the Hradec Králové Square, the beautiful Baroque sculpture of the Virgin Mary was used as a tribune by the speaker and the exuberant crowd of young people, and that this sculpture was somewhat damaged. I have therefore intervened, since on the 1st of May, a similar camp is to be held in the local square at the local political office, so that measures may be taken to prevent a repetition of that regrettable case. Correspondents volunteered to act as district conservators, but they were very often outstanding experts far beyond the local context. Their main task was documentation of monuments. They provided information, inventories, or photographs. The higher authorities made use of their knowledge of local conditions and situation, and they were therefore called upon to consult or intervene on behalf of a particular building or object. Furthermore, the Ministry of Education and National Information or the Monuments Office could assign district conservators to supervise the excavations and restoration of monuments, and the 1919 instruction called them trustees of the Education Department of the Ministry. In the presentation, you can now see excerpts from correspondence addressed to Hugo Doskočil that show various proposals for artistic design of parts of altars or whole sections of liturgical spaces sent for comment. The agenda associated with conservation work was indeed quite extensive and included a large number of topics. Hugo Doskočil was approached by the Conservation Authority, local government officials, but also by individual spiritual administrators or teachers. Sometimes he was asked for advice, sometimes for intervention in particular matter, but in some cases the district conservator himself took the initiative. Typical situations in which the conservator intervened occurred when sacred or other buildings were repaired, their appearance modified, new roads were built, statues in public spaces were damaged, proposals were made to drastically change the historic character of the urban environment, or during various repairs. He received a number of letters of note. The position of the district conservator was based not only on professional and local knowledge, but also on involvement in professional and local networks in which he was recognized as an expert. The exercise of the post-war, not of course limited to written communication, but involved face-to-face meetings with stakeholders, travel in case of parishes, sometimes combined with visitations, and on-site visits. Among the letters, we sometimes find testimony to the peripatetic nature of the negotiations. An example is a letter from Adolf Hubálek, parish priest in Kišperk, now Letohrad, dated 1926. I quote, "They want to introduce electric light in the church of Končice, and what cannot be approved also around the painting of the altar. The frame of the picture would not even bear it. Then the cord of bulbs is not reliable. I don't want them. I won't allow it. You can talk them out of it. I have a real problem with such stubbornness. They understand everything better than I do, so let them hear it from competent places." End of quote. Involvement in church and secular structures was manifested directly in Hradec Králové. Hugo Doskočil dealt intensively not only with the state of the local sacral monuments, but also with the dismantling of the city walls in connection with the development of the city between the world wars, and repeatedly collaborated with the architect Boža Dvořák from Pardubice and the priest and politician František Reil. When Bishop Moritz Pícha undertook the renovation of the Cathedral of the Holy Spirit in the 1930s, Hugo Doskočil became one of the main advisors throughout the work. For example, a text from 1937 in connection with the ventilation system and the restoration of the entrance to the crypt states, I quote, "The actual execution of the work will always be according to the actual ascertainment of the condition, according to the common agreement and respect for the wishes of Mr. Hugo Doskočil, the conservator." He had detailed reports from the builder on the condition of various parts of the bishop's church and suggestions for actions, as some parts suffered from a combination of several ailments. The builder Robert Schmidt also conveys to us the current situation of the great economic crisis. I quote, "Elsewhere, there is less of these droppings, but everywhere enough so that everything made of wood and also of stone will soon be destroyed. For pigeon droppings have a destructive effect on stone, iron, and other materials. It is high time, therefore, that the pigeons should be banished from the whole cathedral, as has been done in the Church of Our Lady, that they should be prevented from entering all the attic or the tower and similar places, that if possible, they may be captured and eventually distributed to the poor and unemployed." In collaboration with Boža Dvořák, Hugo Doskočil prepared a new heraldic decoration of the presbytery in the cathedral, which was added later. Hugo Doskočil also acted as a mediator between the military administration and the State Heritage Office. When the headquarters of the 4th Infantry Division, the former College of Society of Jesus, now the new Adalbertinum building, was being repaired in Hradec Králové, the soldiers asked for subsidies because the district conservator insisted on repairing some of the stone elements, which led to an increase in the budget. In addition to Hradec Králové itself, he paid adequate attention to the properties of the bishopric in Chrast, near Chrudim, where repairs were carried out during the so-called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. But Hugo Doskočil did not limit himself to teaching in the seminary and to correspondence or sending photographs of monuments. Among his hobbies was campanology, the knowledge of which he used extensively in a number of lectures and in saving bells from requisition during both world wars, collaborating with Václav Wagner and Jaroslav Dobrodinsky. In making casts of bells to be destroyed for war purposes, he used the help of seminary alumni, and during the years of the so-called Protectorate, he collaborated on the radio program entitled The Bells of My Region, which conveyed to listeners the voices of bells from various parts of the occupied country. According to available memories, Hugo Doskočil had an absolute musical ear, and his consultations in repairing musical instruments are documented. His other areas of interest were horses. He certainly had a relationship with them because of his origin, but according to the available information, he contributed to the rescue of the old Kladruben horse breeding at a time of considerable difficulties for the stud farm, now a national cultural monument and a UNESCO site. The successful career of this talented and, as the memoirs of somewhat anxious man make clear, was abruptly interrupted in the middle of the 20th century in connection with the harsh approach of the communist totalitarian rule towards Roman Catholic Church. The retired priest was to continue his conservatory work. In 1947, he was still given a decree for the period until the end of 1950. In August 1949, however, he was arrested, and in the subsequently fabricated trial of Dr. Hugo Doskočil and company, he was convicted as an alleged agent for his involvement in the printing of anti-state leaflets and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He spent the first half of the 1950s behind the walls of the prison of Plzeň, Bory and Valdice, which we can see on the photographs. The President of the Republic, Antonín Zápotocký, granted him a pardon on the 13th of January 1955, after half of his sentence had expired, and he did not gain his honorary civil rights until the 18th of July 1956. And his return from prison, after his return from prison, he lived in seclusion in Hradec Králové, where he died in 1961. Among the documents of the time and of the persecution of the Roman Catholic clergy is a document from May 1955, in which the consistory, which never received official notification of the conviction, asked for remission of payment for treatment in the hospital. I quote, Dr. Hugo Doskočil, released from detention in Valdice on the 2nd of February 1955, he found himself completely destitute and is living on charity, pending the settlement of his pension application. We refer to Hugo Doskočil in the title of our paper as diocesan conservator. Although this designation was not known in the systematization of this bishopric, it appears only sporadically in texts, and the Diocesan Conservator Center of the Diocese of Hradec Králové was not established until 2005. The designation was, however, used by Bishop Moritz Pícha in his thanks at the ceremonial reopening of the Hradec Králové Cathedral in 1941. I quote, I found almost everywhere our rural churches of Eastern Bohemia, often gems of architectural art, not only in the best condition, but directly beautifully repaired and decorated. Thanks to the zeal of the spiritual administrators and the great dedication of faithful and the patrons of the churches, but also thanks to the immeasurable love and professional intervention of our diocesan conservator, the prelate, Monsignor Hugo Doskočil himself. In his own person, Hugo Doskočil bridged worlds that were once strictly separated, especially in the post-1918 period. He managed to successfully establish himself within the diocesan court as a gifted priest, and at the same time he held the position of district conservator in the Czechoslovak Republic for many years. We can therefore place him among other, sometimes better known clerical figures who chose history, art history, and conservation as their areas of professional interest and established themselves in both ecclesiastic and profane settings. In terms of enthusiasm and erudition, acquired through his own diligence, Hugo Doskočil can be compared to Bishop Antonín Podlaha in terms of talent and long-term ascendancy until after 1948. He is, in some respects, close to Josef Cibulka. In conclusion, I quote a passage from the legitimation signed by Zdeněk in 1919 about the district conservator. I quote, his task is to watch over the historical monuments in his area of activity and to report on their condition. All state, municipal and ecclesiastical authorities are called upon to be of every possible assistance and to facilitate the exercise of his honorary office. That is all from our part. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks to both of you, Mr. Sklenář and Mr. Holoubek, the co-authors and co-speakers. We have very little time left for the discussion. And we have received some questions from the audience. So we will now have the discussion We have 3 questions from our colleague from the Heritage Institute of the Slovak Republic, Tomáš Kovalský. So the first question is addressed to Michal Sklenář. How, in the context of deep historical overview of the history of religiosity, do you approach cases of mockery towards religiosity and devotion faced by Slovak inhabitants after 1980 from Czech soldiers and other employees? Yes, this is not a specificity of the time after 1945. Just like when Czechs came to the traditional Slovak environment, Orthodox or Roman Catholic, there were also some negative reactions, and there were also similar cases, similar situation for Slovak inhabitants coming to the borderlands after the war. So this cannot be said to be caused by the particular time or nationality. It's the general situation of when people are leaving their homeland and entering a new environment, hoping for a better life. And this change can be related to a change in the person's spirituality. But I suppose the question is about the more systematic expressions. Thank you on behalf of Mr. Kowalski. The second question addressed to Mr. van der Meulen. Have you received the translation of the question? I suppose not.
No.
In that case, I will read the question and you will get the translation, the interpretation. So the question is, what was the reflection of the reconstruction of the city of Warsaw in the West, in the then capitalist world? How was it reflected? Not just in terms of a reflection in international charters. Were there any deeper reactions going beyond some reports from the travels?
Oh, well, that's a question I find very difficult to answer now. I haven't studied this, what the reception of Westerners from the period was. I know, of course, as said, publications like Adolf Seborowski were published in several languages, in French and in English, and they were always distributed as sort of propaganda also in the Western countries. I could say what is interesting, I think, is that when we talk generally also in the West about the reconstruction of Warsaw, we always look at the so-called Stare Miasto, and sometimes extended with Stare Miasto and Nowe Miasto. But the last example of St. Alexander's Church is far from this historical center. So I think also most research that has been done, and also the reception of the people, when they look at reconstruction of Warsaw, they look at Stare Miasto and forget that also the largest part is actually the outer, where the center is now. And also that was what I said, the general design in a Stalinist way with the selected heritage monuments, which is, I think, much more interesting than only Staré Město. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. A nyní tedy poslední otázka, která opět teda dorazila od pana Kovalského.
Thank you very much. And now we have the last question addressed to Vít Honys. In the rich historiographic production of the Czech Republic, is there any topography of the lost sites and monuments in the mining area of Most? This question can only be answered partly. Over 20 years ago, an article was published by Dr. Kraus in the publication The Memory of the Most Regions, giving an overview of the relocated monuments from the Most region. I have to say that in terms of the region as such, this was not fully researched because many of the monuments were scattered and they are still appearing nowadays, or they are being looked for. So it is not very well researched and studied, even as far as the stone statues are concerned. Some of them are even not identified. Some of the works are now private property because they were traded, handled. So it's an open topic. It's a big problem for the furnishings, the interior furnishings. Some artifacts are in Slovakia, in Slovak churches, like the altar from Tušimice, which is now in the Slovak church in the village of Sena. Also, I was informed that 2 organs from the Most region were just identified, found in Slovak churches in the Levice region. So what I can say is that what we know is just a segment, just a part of the reality. There were some bachelor theses done on this subject, but there is no complex overview. There are still many question marks, lots of research to be done. Many thanks. And now the last question of this panel.
Na Michala Sklenáře.
So we have a last question again for Michal Sklenář. It was posed by Michal Sklanath. I think that you can't see it, so I will read the question. Thank you for very interesting contributions. As Derek said, people are just people and then cannot be more than that. If we look on the desacralization, what was its main motive, especially in the wilder periods of history? What were the main reasons, whether it's theological, philosophical, political convictions, or more the idea of easy money that could be made? What were the main reasons? Thank you. Thank you for that question. We sometimes tend to see the parallels with other fields, but at the same time, we have to take into consideration also the local context of local communities, villages, where people come to, and their houses and churches that are dilapidating, that are falling into ruins. And yesterday, what was mentioned yesterday, we had the term gold digger. So this is something that can play a role too. For instance, the newly arrived population could dig for gold, as to say, and collect the tombstones from Jewish cemeteries because of precious stones, or not because precious stones, but because of nice or granite or other stones. Thank you for your answer. So I will close this section. We will meet up again at 2:15. I would like to thank all the speakers and to our audience. And the second part of this section, Sacral Monuments and Authoritarian Regimes, will be opened according to the time schedule, that is to say at 2:15. Thank you once again to you and our viewers, and we will resume our work after the lunch break. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.